You might think this is the closing. Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is right here. The bad news is Tad asked me to deliver it a few hours ago. So Tad and I were talking after this morning's sermons. Melissa and I often attend regularly to both services, and it's a great opportunity for us to pray twice, sing twice as much, and hear the sermon twice. And you might think that that actually means hearing it repeated. It is not repeated. In fact, I'd encourage you all to attend both services, because even though we have the same minister and the same notes, it's two different services, two different sermons and everything. But it's a wonderful time to hear from the Word of God and to hear a message well delivered. So we had an excellent discussion after second service. And as we were talking, Tad had the idea. He said, I have an idea on a sermon this evening, and I'd like your help. I have an illustration, and I need your help with the illustration. I said, sure, what can I do to help? We started talking more about it. Before I knew it, I was agreeing to deliver the whole message. But just as a recap, before we get into it, we're going to recap this morning. And if you were here in attendance, you experienced a powerful message this morning. It was a wonderful message on how to love like Christ. It's predicated on Mark 12:28, firstly, that says, love your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. But then in John 13:34, we get a new command, literally. A new command I give to you, that you love one another just as I loved you. You are to love one another. It's a high bar to meet, very high bar. But Tad gave us a lot of good examples on how we can try to achieve that. It was very moving, and during both services, during each service, I should say, we had someone come forward. After the first service, we had a young man, Brother Jacob, who came forward, who is just at the beginning of his Christian walk. He's less than a year since he's been baptized, and he is experiencing all the newness of being a Christian, but also being pierced by all the commands that we have and how to walk that walk. And he came forward, and he asked for prayers, because he felt that he was not loving like Jesus in everything. He came forward and said that there are times that there are people around him that are not being nice to him, and he's not loving like Jesus. That's a tough one to answer. Before we get into it, though, then during the second service, we had Sister Jeannie come forward. Here's someone who has self-proclaimed been a Christian for 62 years, who has helped thousands of people in her walk. I think she's a wonderful example, and she came forward for the same prayer request. I don't feel like I love like Jesus. How can I love like Jesus? The answer is the same, too. And during the close of the second service, tearfully, I had mentioned that it's a high bar. We should be striving for it every day. But how do we do it? So as Tad and I were talking, his idea for the sermon was he wanted me to be a part of that, and he wanted me to share part of my testimony. And that's what I was willing to do. He said, I know it's short notice, but would you be willing to do it? I said, it's my testimony. Of course I know it. I'd love to share it. And even last summer, as we had our young adults class, partly one of the things we talked about was you need to be prepared to share your testimony. It could be 2 minutes, but thankfully it's the evening service and I don't have to be limited by 2 minutes. But you have to be prepared to share it. And I'm going to share it tonight, but I'm also would like to share it in context with the lesson that we had this morning, because I think it goes hand in hand. Please don't confuse any of this as my boasting, because I do not boast in myself. I boast in Jesus and the power of him and his salvation that he's given to us. But I want to share some of that story with you. And I apologize, I'm going to start back on day one. And day one, I just want to give you an idea, a little bit of my upbringing. But day one, I am the youngest of 6 kids. Yeah. Libby was like, oh, yeah, exactly. Youngest of 6 kids. I have 4 older sisters and had an older brother and me. Well, a couple months before I was born, my brother passed away. He was a sickly infant, and he passed away just a couple months before I was born. So you can imagine the difficulty that was for my parents. I was born, and then 6 short years later, the youngest of my 4 older sisters passed away from cancer. So my parents had to experience the loss of 2 children. And I know there are those here with us even tonight that have experienced that loss. And that is a loss that I would wish on nobody. I think it has the power to draw a married couple together, and I think it also has the power to break a marriage apart without the love and power of God in that relationship. Well, my parents struggled. My parents had a difficult time during this time. We moved around because of health and business reasons, but my parents struggled during this time, and I think it ultimately resulted in them being divorced when I was a teenager. But I had a lot of memories growing up, and it started at my sister's funeral, one of my earliest memories. And during that time, I have to be honest, I was struggling with the concept of why would God take my 11-year-old sister just a few days before her birthday? I couldn't resolve that in my head. It stuck with me for many years. I kept growing up. I was raised Catholic to mean that we didn't go often, but I went through a lot of the rigor of Catholicism. But I always felt distant from God. That never drew me closer to God. It drew me closer to kneel down, stand up, make the sign of the cross, things of that nature, but it was never a closer relationship with God. So as I grew, and like I had mentioned, when I was a teenager, my parents got separated, they got divorced, and there was a lot of turmoil in my life. And so there was not much church structure as I grew up. I yearned for it. I wanted to actively know it. I just knew that I didn't want that layer of man, between me and God. I needed to be able to have that personal relationship with God, but I didn't have that example of how to do it. As I mentioned, my parents struggled. My dad was an alcoholic. Their marriage was not strong. There was not strong examples. And again, I was the youngest of 6, with 2 children passed away between me and my 3 older sisters, who were 7, 8, and 9 years older than I was. So during those crucial times, our house was divided. My sisters were married, starting families off on their own. So during that time was a time that I was yearning for the structure of family, the structure of consistency. And so even during late high school and then into college, I would often travel to my oldest sister's house, wherever they lived, because it was family. It was a husband, wife, 2 kids, the loving home that it was. It was just a wonderful place to go. I loved going there. And so even after I graduated from undergraduate degree, I lived in Colorado. I was moving to Washington, D.C. to become a U.S. patent examiner. But my oldest sister lived in Chicago, and I was going to travel up to Chicago and spend a few days there. Yes, out of the way, but it was free room and board for a night. I didn't have to pay for a hotel. So, good idea for me. Well, as I was there, one of the things, I got to talking with my sister, and her and my brother-in-law offered up that I could move in with them. He offered me a job to work in his company. And because I didn't have a job to go to or a place to go to in D.C., I was a young 22-year-old without much direction, I took him up on it. So I lived with him for a while. And I continued to have that exposure to a solid Christian home through my sister. Well, much to her dismay, there were many times that we would be up. We'd be talking over the kitchen table. And again, we were all raised Catholic, but by this time, all three of my sisters had moved to Bible-based churches. They had good foundation, and they were walking the Christian walk. Although I didn't quite know it yet, how to walk that walk. But my oldest sister, there were many times that she would be exposing me to the Bible. She'd be exposing me to Jesus. She'd be sharing with me all that good news. It was in the form of discussions over a kitchen table. It was also in the form of, sometimes it was debates. I was always really interested in learning more. That's just my makeup. Background is engineering. I have a law degree. I just want to analyze things. I'm sorry, everyone. But because of that, we'd have deep conversations. Many of them would go on for hours over that kitchen table because I was seeking. I wanted to know more, but I also needed to know it. I needed to understand it, and I need to own that faith. And so when I did, and we'd have these discussions, I have to admit, sometimes those discussions ended with her just being frustrated with me, and she got up and walked away. But she never stopped. She kept planting that seed. We kept talking. We kept sharing. She kept being an example in my life of a good Christian home, Christian examples. So the years went on, and she kept working on me. A seed here, a seed there, a seed here, a seed there. And we would continue to talk, and she'd continue to work, and I would continue to seek. I needed to own my own faith. Well, Melissa and I had met by now, and we were starting our time together, and eventually we got married, and I was still in the seeking phase in my mid-20s. My sister just kept working. By this point now, I had moved here to the Detroit area. Melissa was born and raised here. She had a lot of family here. My family was spread out all over the place, so we made roots in the Detroit area. And my sister still lived in Chicago, still actively involved, and she was still working on me from a distance. Well, she had a small group that they participated in. And that small group would get together, like most small groups, live life together, pray together. And one of the things that they would often pray about is me and my new bride, Melissa. And she continued to pray, continued to work. Well, she would send me books. We'd have conversations on the phone. And she sent me a book that really struck at my heart. It was, I'll even mention it, was Lee Strobel's A Case for Christ. If you don't know who Lee Strobel is, he is a journalist, he's a lawyer, but he married a very godly woman, and he was self-proclaimed agnostic, but really wanted to know more about, his wife's faith. He started down the road of essentially saying, I am going to interview the authority on all of these Christian issues, these Christian hot button issues. I'm going to interview the authority both in support of it on the Christian side and on the opposite side. And I am going to get so much evidence, I'm going to prove my wife that her whole faith is ridiculous. Well, that's not how it turns out. Because as he started to examine the authority of all of this, he realized the truth. He realized the authority of the Bible. It struck me. We're kind of made up of the same type. I want to analyze. I want to understand. I want to fully vet an issue. And so to do that, I want to examine both sides. Well, this book really struck me. And when it did, it was the very first time that I could fully understand the historical, accurate truths that are in this Bible. Amen. It was at that moment that I could take this and say, it's not just stories. These are truths. These are truths to be lived by. These are historical truths. These are medical truths. These are astrology or astronomy, truths. But these are all truths. It was a wonderful time. here's where we're going to get back to the message this morning. The message is how to love like Jesus. How do we do that? And what I would say is start with the small things, because my story hasn't stopped. It hasn't fully started yet. You see, I told my sister about how encouraged I was by all of this, and Melissa and I really wanted to find a good church, a church that I could continue to learn, a church that doesn't have a lot of layers on top of it, of tradition, if you will, a church that is founded on the Bible. I wanted that kind of church. Well, this just made my sister just so happy. So she proclaimed to her small group what a wonderful message this was. And so it was an answer to their prayers and all of the seed planting she had been doing. Well, someone in that small group, and this is in the Chicago area, said, there is a family from our church in Chicago that just moved to the Detroit area. Maybe they might know of a good church in the area. And my sister said, that's a great idea. So my sister reached out to this family. For those of you who have been here a long time, you may recognize the name the Fuqua family. This is a family that had been at Waterford decades ago and very involved. Well, my sister had reached out to the Fuquas and had gotten a recommendation for Waterford Church of Christ. That's how we found Waterford Church of Christ. But when it happened, we found out more about the Fuquas story. See, the Fuquas had they were moving from Chicago to the Detroit area. They didn't have a place to stay. They didn't have a job. They didn't have a lot of things. What they did have were several kids, and they had a tent. So they were living in a tent in a campsite. Well, there was a family, actually just a husband and wife, who were right at the campsite right next door to them. For those who have been here for a while, the Axe family might ring a bell. So John and Carol Axe were camping at a campsite. And at that campsite, they befriended a family at the campsite next door. They got to know this family, and this family needed help. This family didn't have a place to stay. This family was living in a campsite in a tent, a family. John and Carol Axe showed a small bit of love and said, why don't you come live in an RV that we have on our property until you can get established locally? So the Fuquas moved into an RV on the Axe's property. Okay? So I start thinking about all of this, and I start thinking about the little acts of love, the little things that I would say is loving like Jesus. I would say that my sister, for many years, loved like Jesus. She would be a Christian example. She would share the word. She would get frustrated, yes, but she would share the word constantly, not giving up, lovingly. Then I'd also say, even her small group, loving in a Christian way, praying for somebody who is lost, praying that God will intercede here and help. I would also say that the Fuquas were loving like Jesus. I think that aspect of receiving a phone call from a stranger in the city you just left, who you don't know, but answering questions about the church that you attend. I would also say that most importantly, perhaps, is John and Carol Axe befriending a family at a campsite next to you, inviting them in and showing love. Not showing love for the reason that it was actually going to cascade into all these other things, but showing love simply because Somebody needed help. Somebody needed love. Somebody needed care. Somebody needed a place to live. And I think that those are the examples that cascade through all of our lives. If we look for those little examples to show love to one another, we don't have to look for big, grandiose reasons. We don't have to look for big, overt statements. What we do have to do is find that little opportunity to love someone, whether it is just helping out in one way or the other, picking up a phone call, answering a phone call, showing love to someone in a campsite, showing love to someone that you're passing on the street. Those, I think, is loving like Jesus. Yes, I understand that Jesus loves us so much more than that. Please don't misinterpret what I'm saying, because what I really want to encourage you is to start small. Jesus loved us so much that he was willing to die on a cross for us. Jesus loved us so much that he came off of the throne to be like us. Jesus loved us so much that he was willing to live that perfect life as an example for us. What I want us to do, though, is to not feel defeated. I want us to feel that we can make a change if we just simply allow God to use us. Be available for God. Be available for one another. You know, it's when we start getting out of our own way, I think, is when the blessings start flowing. When we start just simply opening up our home. We simply start loving on one another. We just start acting like Christians. And that might be pulling near to a brother or a sister to keep them strong, because we all draw weak at times. But it also may be when we need to show somebody who doesn't know Jesus the good news that we have. You know, we can take this in so many different ways too. We can talk about, I think where Tad was going to be going with this tonight, was being born again. My testimony is your testimony. Each one of us has our own testimony, our own walk. There are those who have lived their entire lives in a church body. They have been blessed since such a young age. And there are those that are seniors who are only just now finding the grace of God. But all of us in between, we can do so much, and we can love on one another, and we can do the work, not for our glory, but for God's. But that's where it kind of starts. We all need to seek out those that are seeking, so that we can help them come to Christ also, to be born again. You know, it's always a miraculous image to think of Jesus talking to Nicodemus. This wasn't around 5,000 people. It was face to face. And he explained to Nicodemus that you must be born again. Nicodemus was confused. But it's pretty simple. You need to accept the salvation that is in Jesus. You need to share that salvation with others. It's a simple matter. It's going to take us a lifetime to even draw close. But that's our duty. That's our duty. So that's my story. It's for the glory of God. I'm not meant to boast in it, but I encourage you all to think about what your testimony is. And I encourage all of you to share it with whomever will listen, whoever needs it, and share that good news along the way. It starts with having that energy, having that courage to come forward. But also, if you haven't been born again, it starts with loving Jesus. It starts with accepting his salvation. And the only way you can do that is to be born into him. So if you are subject to the invitation, we ask you to come forward now as we stand